Hello everybody! Today we're talking about chapters 9 through 16 of The Order of the Phoenix. And I want to talk about a theme that I saw a lot in these chapters, which is control, and specifically self-control. So we talked a lot last week about Harry's trauma and how we might read Harry's depiction in this book as someone experiencing PTSD. And that's not just Harry's feelings and behavior. We know that his trauma is manifesting as guilt, self-doubt, and most obviously as anger, but also other characters' response to Harry, and even readers' response to Harry in this book. So with that in mind, I think it's notable that the advice that Harry's being given in this book so far, in both well-meaning ways and cruel ways, is that he needs to learn to control himself, control his temper. Members of the Order tell him this right before his disciplinary hearing at the Ministry. Whatever you do, just don't lose your temper. And this echoes the ways in which our society tells oppressed people that there's a right way to go about asking for your rights, a calm way, a civilized way. And also the ways in which our society requires people of color to show not a hint of anger when dealing with police and other authority figures, lest they be perceived as threatening. Harry, of course, is our white boy, straight, cisgender, chosen one protagonist, and we can definitely think about what it means that Rowling is transferring the experiences of real-world marginalized groups onto this universal, by which I mean all kinds of privileged protagonist, what Judith Butler would call a grievable subject. And this is something that Rowling does a lot in the series, most obviously in making white muggles and muggle-born characters who are harassed and assaulted by pure-blood supremacists sort of stand in for the real-world experiences of people of color, who are themselves mostly invisible in these books. But I'm getting a little bit away from my topic. All I really want to say is that in this context, we might think of Harry as standing in for all of those populations who are required to keep their anger in check so as not to upset their oppressors or offend their supposed allies. And when Harry gets to Hogwarts, he's similarly told again and again that he must control his anger. McGonagall tells him this in the classic "have a biscuit, Potter" scene. So here we see that there are larger forces at play. She understands and agrees that Umbridge is horrible and the Ministry is out to get Harry, so she's urging him to control himself as a strategy. But as we keep Harry's trauma in mind, I think it has to be said again that desserts are not a substitute for actual mental health care. So Dumbledore's suggestion of hot chocolate for Ginny in Chamber of Secrets, or McGonagall's offer of a cookie here, are woefully inadequate. And the assumption that Harry can control his anger and that failure to do so should result in punishment, even if it wasn't a horrific punishment, completely dismisses his experience and puts the burden on him to sort of smash down these feelings in what's almost certain to be an unhealthy way. And I think we see a little bit of that in Harry's response to Umbridge's detention. So let's talk about that detention. Harry gets detention because he yells at Umbridge and contradicts her lies about Voldemort's return. So this detention is right from the start a way of controlling Harry and controlling other students' perception of him. And the actual detention, in which Harry uses Umbridge's special quill to carve into his hand a phrase that he doesn't believe, "I must not tell lies," furthers that control. She's showing him that she can force him to hurt himself. And this has echoes of the real-world educational practices of both corporal punishment in schools as a way for adults to demonstrate their control over students, and also making students write lines on the board, which is usually a combination of humiliation and repetition of a desired message of self-discipline. So again, all about control. But Harry's response, I think, is interesting. He sees this as a contest of wills. He can't stop himself from shouting at Umbridge in class, but he can stop himself giving voice or complaint to the physical pain that she's causing him. And that's where I think we have to consider whether there's a difference between self-control and stoicism or stubbornness. Harry's friends urge him to go to Dumbledore or another adult about this. Clearly, even in a school where Snape routinely bullies everyone, Umbridge has crossed a line. And to Ron's credit, he is as adamant as Hermione that Harry should report this. He doesn't make this sort of a masculine stoicism thing. But Harry won't report it, and maybe that's simple stubbornness, kind of a twisted kind of self-control. But I'm also reminded that Harry suffered 10 years of mistreatment at the hands of the Dursleys. Unlike Ron and Hermione, he's been physically controlled and bullied by an adult in a situation that was essentially inescapable. And I wonder if, as a small child, Harry ever tried to tell anyone about what was happening at the Dursleys. Either he didn't, and he may have developed coping strategies like these instead, or he did, and whoever he told evidently let him down, since we know what Harry's life looked like at the beginning of the series. Harry may also fear that people won't believe him. This is already what's happening with the story that Voldemort's returned. The Ministry's gaslighting him and spreading rumors of the press that he's mentally unstable and attention-seeking. And this time, he would be accusing an authority figure, a teacher, of abusing him. And again, we see echoes of our world here. I'm thinking specifically of the victim-blaming and discrediting and disbelieving and power imbalances that make it so difficult and re-traumatizing for survivors of sexual assault to report or even talk about their experiences. Which is why it's so important that Ron and Hermione 100% believe and support Harry. They urge him to report what Umbridge is doing, but when he chooses not to, they continue to believe him and stick with him and support him how they can. And this is such a contrast to the beginning of the book, when Harry was stuck at the Dursleys alone and was beginning to doubt his own reality. At Hogwarts, he's even more aware that people aren't believing him about Voldemort, and that angers him, but he isn't isolated. There are people who believe him, and that gives Harry more confidence in himself, in his story, and in his own abilities, which eventually allows him to agree to teach other students to defend themselves. And this is an important moment because it's a way that not just Harry, but also his classmates take control of their own education. Throughout the series, we've seen that the trio learns most of what they learn at Hogwarts outside of the classroom, whether that's in the library or in the bathroom, brewing Polyjuice Potion, practicing hexes for the Triwizard Tournaments, having various illicit adventures. So there's always been an element of experiential, self-guided learning. And we can speculate on whether other students outside of Harry's narrative perspective are also following their own interests in learning magic outside of the official Hogwarts curriculum. But this is a book that kicks it up a notch because it becomes really necessary. The Ministry of Magic is trying to control what's happening at Hogwarts. They're afraid that Dumbledore is building an army of loyal students to rise up against Fudge and the Ministry. So we see Umbridge launching a review of the pedagogy of Hogwarts, which is frankly overdue, but motivated by paranoia and pretty unlikely to lead to any of the changes that might actually improve the school. And we see a shift in the Defense Against the Dark Arts curriculum to emphasize theory over practice, which is a real change. If you can remember back to Book 3, Lupin's final exam was sort of a monster obstacle course. So it's not just the teaching, but even the assessment that's been practical in the past. But this theoretical curriculum is meant to control students by keeping them from developing useful fighting skills and also from being radicalized by the idea that there might be anyone out there to fight. The students who believe Harry about Voldemort obviously recognize this as quite a bad approach that leaves them vulnerable to all kinds of threats beyond Hogwarts, and if we're being honest, within Hogwarts as well. So they form a kind of Defense Against the Dark Arts club to take control of their education and safety, which has the additional effects of fulfilling the Sorting Hat's call for the houses to work together, well, 3 out of 4 houses anyway, and it also gives Harry an outlet and focus for some of his overwhelming emotions that's not simply shoving them down. But I do want to acknowledge that outside of the context of his PTSD and his related anger, Harry actually could stand to learn some self-control, in the sense that he's always been an impulsive character. I think it's been pretty age-appropriate, but now that he's getting older, more self-control and slowing down to think things through would be a huge asset to Harry, and we're definitely going to see that in this book. So I want to think about what is effective in getting Harry to control his impulses in the chapters we read. One surprising thing, to me anyway, was Snape. When Harry doesn't correctly follow the instructions to brew the Draft of Peace, Snape vanishes the potion and Harry gets a 0. The next lesson, when he's brewing a strengthening solution, the text tells us, determined not to give Snape an excuse to fail him this lesson, Harry read and reread every line of the instructions on the blackboard at least 3 times before acting on them. And his potion comes out much better. So while I obviously don't like Snape's bullying, his insistence on paying close attention and being precise when the students are doing something that's the magical equivalent of making pharmaceuticals is actually quite reasonable, and in this case anyway, gets Harry to slow down and do it right. Harry shows a similar kind of thoughtfulness when writing a cryptic letter to Sirius. Instead of just dashing off his thoughts as they come to him, as we've seen in a lot of previous notes to Sirius, Harry crafts a really careful letter that conveys his concerns without including any information that would be dangerous if it were intercepted. Another point in these chapters where we see Harry practicing self-control is every time he speaks to Cho. Because of his nerves, he's hyper-conscious of everything he says and does with his body. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the conversations always go well, but they do show Harry being much more aware of himself. But I think we see Harry working hardest to control his impulses and his temper with his friends. Again, he's not 100% successful at this, but he's definitely trying. One example of this is when Ron gets his prefect letter. Everyone is surprised, and Harry is jealous. He feels that it should have been him instead. But while Ron is out of the room, Harry has this little talk with himself, in which he essentially talks himself down and convinces himself to respond maturely and congratulate Ron and not make it super weird. Which is such a relief to Ron, given that Harry's been pretty angry up to this point, and also given that Ron rarely gets recognized for anything. In a more general sense, Harry keeps working on not directing his anger toward Ron and Hermione. It's completely understandable that a traumatized Harry would take out his anger on the people closest to him, especially when he feels that they didn't show up for him over the summer. And they're very empathetic, but the text also describes Hermione as looking fearful during one of Harry's outbursts at Grimmauld Place. So I was glad to see Ron and Hermione setting some boundaries with Harry and reminding him that they're on his side. It's also worth considering for a minute how the adults in Harry's life do and do not model self-control. So for example, Sirius, poor, sad, traumatized Sirius, is not a great model of self-control. In fact, it's Harry who has to tell Sirius not to come to Hogsmeade, even though it's clear that Harry would love to see him. Then there's Professor McGonagall, who repeatedly cautions Harry not to lose his temper with Umbridge, and then, to the delight of her students, struggles to keep her cool when Umbridge comes to observe her class. Harry even whispers to Ron how she can lecture me about not losing my temper with Umbridge. But in the bigger picture, I think we can see Professor McGonagall walking a really fine line. She's clinging to her autonomy in the classroom, while also being careful not to vocally oppose the Ministry's interference at Hogwarts. This is a strategic position that we'll see Professor McGonagall continue to hold throughout the series, allowing her to stay on and do what she can from the inside. Molly and Arthur Weasley also provide interesting models of self-control. Right after Harry's disciplinary hearing, Harry and Arthur first pass Percy, who doesn't speak to his dad, and vice versa, which falls into that kind of gray area between self-control and stubbornness. But next they run into Fudge and Lucius Malfoy. And Arthur and Lucius have a history, to put it mildly. In Chamber of Secrets they had a fist fight in a bookstore, and then Lucius almost got Arthur's daughter murdered. In this encounter, as usual, Lucius tries to bait both Harry and Arthur, but Arthur keeps his temper and grips Harry's shoulder, warning him to keep his too. Arthur's already risking Fudge's displeasure and his job just by associating with Harry, so he knows he must keep calm and not give Fudge an excuse to fire him. Molly's self-control is more complicated. She's doing so much unrecognized labor for the Order. Grimmauld Place is Sirius's house, but it's Molly who's cleaning it while Sirius complains and makes sarcastic comments. But she's also doing so much emotional labor, taking care of her own children and other people's children and all of these traumatized adults, and worrying about everyone and not talking about Percy because it upsets Arthur, and on and on and on. And she's carrying all of that. So when Molly finally breaks down sobbing while trying to get rid of this Bogart that's flashing her family's corpses at her, that feels super understandable. And it's painful to watch Molly and the others kind of minimize her emotions, and then Molly asks them not to tell Arthur because she's trying to be strong for him and not worry him. And it makes me think about the gendered ways in which we think about self-control and what are acceptable ways for male and female characters to lose control, and what forms of control and what forms of losing control we take seriously. What would happen if Harry broke down in tears? We saw him cry at the end of Goblet of Fire. What if he did that again? What would the other characters do? Umbridge exerts her control with a kind of hyper-femininity that's all false sweetness and simpering. What would it look like if she exerted her control through shouting? And where we see characters of color in this book, we can think about intersections of race and gender when it comes to control, or self-control and losing control. When Professor McGonagall reprimands Angelina for shouting at Harry in the Great Hall, is she responding in part to Angelina's race and gender? Is either McGonagall or the author influenced by angry black woman tropes and stereotypes? Similarly, we're not there yet, so I won't go into this, but we're going to see Harry exasperated by Cho's frequent crying, and we can wonder whether there are racial stereotypes at play there too. So this has gotten long, so I want to end here and just say this is a book about politics, so we're going to see a lot more about control, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this.